To tape the message separately, so we'll see what hits the podcast and what hits the live. I don't know if we're going to keep this version live or if we'll just post the message itself up, but we'll see as we go. But anyway, we're in Mark chapter 16 this morning. Mark chapter 16, wrapping up our study through the Gospel of Mark. This has been, I think, a 23-week journey through Mark's Gospel. It's been interesting. It's been enlightening. Mark has kept at a pretty good clip, a pretty good pace. He's always moving forward with some speed, and we felt that through much of the study. And he slowed down through the last several chapters into the crucifixion of Jesus, the events immediately leading up to that crucifixion. When we hit Mark 16, as he's wrapping up the gospel, you'll note here that we left Jesus at the end of chapter 15. Jesus is still in the grave. 20 verses later, and he's done. He picks the pace right back up again as he gets to chapter 16. He wanted to get to the cross and the events surrounding the crucifixion. Once he gets past that, he hits the gas again and gets us out. So that's just Mark's pacing as we go. It's just an interesting side note for me as I've been going through the pacing that he keeps and how fast we get through the end of the gospel. So Mark chapter 16. Now when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices that they might come and anoint him. Just as a side note here as we start Mark 16, there is some contention about this word Sabbath here at the beginning of the verse, especially as it relates to when was Jesus crucified. A lot of churches in a more fundamentalist tradition, which a lot of us have come out of, maintain a Wednesday crucifixion. Obviously, the broader church, celebrates Good Friday, observing a Friday crucifixion. And of course, I grew up with churches fighting over this issue, which to my mind isn't really a huge issue, but a couple of kind of factoids on the way through. First of all, we're trying to date something with precision that happened 2,000 years ago under a different calendar system in a different place. That's complex. And so to get super fixated on a particular day can be very difficult. The amount of scholarship you have to put in to intelligently maintain that is tough. That said, we do have a couple of facts that we do know. First of all, Pilate was in Judea only from the year 26 to the year 36 AD. So we have a 10-year window that we can work in as far as trying to figure out what year was Jesus crucified. Because of Pilate's presence and Roman records, we know it's only within a 10-year period that's even possible. The second thing that we know as we try to look at it, we have Jesus' statement that he was going to be buried for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, the debate over that particular statement is some people who say that we should take that literally. Jonah was literally in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus was literally in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights. And from a Friday crucifixion, you can't get 3 days and 3 nights. And so literally it doesn't work. Of course, the other side says, no, that's an idiom, meaning that, it's just an expression that we use. It's like, I'm hungry as a horse. Well, obviously you're not, and you're probably not eating the same things. It's idiomatic language where it doesn't have a direct literal interpretation. And so as long as there was any part of 3 days and 3 nights, we're good. I think the truth is probably somewhere in between those two positions. But with the window that we have and the expression that Jesus has, we try to look back through the calendar to determine when Passover occurred in those years. And as it turns out, there is in that 10-year window, there were a couple of Wednesday Passovers and a couple of Friday Passovers. So it really could go either way. And of course, the two optimal years, best we know, would be either the year 30 or the year 31. And as luck would have it, In the year 30, Passover was on a Wednesday, and in the year 31, it was on a Friday, because there was a leap year. So all of that says it's very difficult to make a die-hard, this is the day and this is the day I'm going to remember it. The bigger question for me, and you asked the question, was Jesus crucified on a Wednesday or a Friday? Remembering that the Jewish day actually starts a half a day before ours makes it a little even more complicated, because what they would call Wednesday Passover, we would call Tuesday evening, and vice. So it just gets crazy. Here's the bottom line. Paul said in Romans 14, and let me jump over there because it's important. Romans chapter 14, beginning in verse 5, the Apostle Paul said, and this is why I use a tablet, I can't even read this. One person esteems one day above another, and another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day to the Lord does not observe it. So, is it right to celebrate Jesus' crucifixion on Wednesday? Yes. Is it right to celebrate Jesus' crucifixion on Friday? Yes. Is it right to not celebrate Jesus' crucifixion at all? Yes. The Apostle Paul gave us the freedom, the liberty in Christ to say, this is the day I'm going to observe this event. And that's the day I do it. Or I'm just not going to observe it. A lot of us, we don't particularly observe in any way Jesus' crucifixion. And that's fine too. So we have the liberty in Christ to do anything that we want relative to that, what day we're going to observe it. Here's where we all agree, though. As we keep reading back in Mark chapter 16, Jesus' resurrection took place on the first day of the week, which under every calendar is Sunday. So we have near universal agreement on that one, and so we just roll with that. Let Easter be Easter, and if you can figure out when that is, that's fantastic. If you're trying to figure out how we figure out Easter, it is the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal eclipse. The vernal equinox. So that's the formula, and that formula, along with the Jewish formula for capturing Passover, will get us about the same time as Passover every year, and that's when we celebrate it. You say, I believe it was April 7th. Well, fine, celebrate Easter on April the 7th. Again, we have that liberty. It doesn't have to be. But, so anyway, back to the text. So Mary and the women here are coming to anoint Jesus' body. They've bought some spices, and the desire was to kind of counteract the odor issue with a freshly dead, soon-to-be rotting corpse. They would load up as much fragrant spices as they could afford, and the idea being, we'll keep the smell of death as muted as possible, even though it's in this, semi-sealed structure with a cave and a rock and all of that stuff. In an arid climate, decomposition happens with some rapidity, but they tried to do what they could to kind of blunt the smell of that a little bit. And so that's what they were going to do as we continue in verse 2. Very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen. And they said among themselves, who will roll away the stone from the door of the tomb for us? And so you have a group of women who've got these spices, they have everything in order. They're heading out to the tomb, and as they're going out to the tomb, they have this conversation among themselves of, how are we going to get in? They have this cave, and it's got a doorway, and a large rock was rolled over in front of the doorway, and they collectively, between themselves, realized that they probably lacked the physical strength to even roll that stone away to access the tomb. And so it's an interesting kind of an aside that they're having among themselves here. And my guess would be, one, they'll figure it out. They're industrious women. No doubt that they're their desire to get something done would be all they need to accomplish it. I know women in general, once you've made up your mind to do something, the how is just a matter of time. It's once the decision is made, the thing is pretty well done, you'll figure it out. There were some guards who were supposed to be there. Now, these were Roman thugs. They weren't the greatest people in the world, but maybe they can be helpful. If not, they'd figure it out. They'd sort it out. So they're having this conversation anyway as they go to the tomb. How are we going to get it open? Verse 4, but when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. They get there and problem solved. The stone is already out of the way. Access is already there. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. And now that word alarmed literally means terrified. This is like horror movie level terror. This is like you saw a ghost for real in your bathroom terror. This is what they're dealing with. They walked into the tomb, they're expecting to find the body of Jesus just laying there, waiting to be anointed with these spices, and instead they find no body of Jesus there, and a guy sitting there in this white cloth waiting for them, who is very much not dead. So yeah, they're freaking out a little bit, and let's be honest, we would be freaking out a lot as well. This is just that kind of a scene. So they were alarmed. That puts it mildly. The word really means terrified. They were beside themselves with fear. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed." And so this person who they didn't expect to be, you don't usually walk into a grave expecting to see a living person. This person who they don't expect to be there says, "Hey, don't be terrified." Because that helps. "You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him as he said to you." And so we get this instruction from the angel who is there. It says, look, he's not here. You go tell his disciples and Peter that he'll meet them later. And so it's an interesting, this particular phrasing is interesting. This idea, go tell the disciples and Peter. Now, bearing in mind that the Gospel of Mark, though written by Mark, is Peter's Gospel. This is Peter's recollection, told to Mark and then written down. And so it's interesting because this particular phrasing does not happen in Matthew or in Luke as they record the resurrection. It's just tell the disciples. It's Mark who captures and Peter. You go tell Peter. Make sure Peter knows. And we think about where is Peter at the moment, having betrayed Jesus or denied Jesus. He is filled with remorse. He is filled with self-doubt. He, like the other disciples, they're in hiding, they're in mourning. They're trying to figure out what they're going to do next because they had really wagered their entire life and livelihood on Jesus and on the kingdom that he was talking about. And now that was all gone. They had no plan B. They didn't know what was coming next. We think about some of the times that we get into the uncertainties with the coronavirus and our lives in general, with or without a pandemic. We get times where we don't know what we're going to do. We don't know what tomorrow's going to look like because we just don't know. The disciples were in that exact same mind. They had no idea what was going to come next. Here it was Sunday. They had no plans for Monday. They didn't know. And Jesus says, hey, or the angel says, hey, Jesus is going to meet them later. Make sure you tell the disciples. Make sure you tell Peter, because Peter's the one who's going to end up leading the early church through the next phase of their mission. Make sure you tell Peter that he is risen and he's going to see them. And so the women did exactly what we would probably do in this situation. as we keep reading in verse 8. So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed, scared, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's where most of us would land. We would run as fast and as far as we could. We would be afraid, and we would be trying to figure out what just happened, but we wouldn't be talking about it with anybody, because when you start talking about, hey, I saw an angel and the dead guy wasn't there anymore, they tend to put you in padded rooms for your own safekeeping. And so they were afraid of what just happened. They were afraid of its implications. They were unsure. They didn't tell anybody. Now, eventually, they told somebody because it's here, so eventually news got out. But that was their initial response. The first people to know Jesus was resurrected told exactly 0 people. Fortunately, the story doesn't stop there, because if the story had stopped there, it would have literally stopped there, I think. But we go on into verse 9. Now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him, as they mourned and wept. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. And so Jesus appears to Mary, and Mark doesn't give us much about the exchange. We can read about that in some of the other Gospels. And she finds out, she goes back to where the disciples are gathered. They're in the upper room. And they're there, and Mark gives us a great statement that they were there mourning and weeping. They were still crying over Jesus. They were still mourning over the life that might have been, that should have been, that wasn't going to be. So you have fear and you have mourning kind of mingled together in this process. And Mary shows up. Hey, great news, Jesus has risen from the dead. And they immediately responded the same way we would. Mary, you're crazy. Dead people don't come back from the dead. Just because you wish he was still here doesn't mean he's still here. And so that was the disciples. That's Peter, and that's James, and that's John. That's all of these foundational figures in the early church and in our faith and in our Bible. Their immediate reaction was disbelief. That's got to be hard. You ever told somebody the good news that Jesus rose from the dead and they didn't believe you? Because dead people don't come back from the dead. Typically, that's our experience. But here was Mary telling them the good news, and even the disciples didn't believe. The guys who had walked with Jesus for years, they didn't believe. The guys who, once they got it together, would begin writing the New Testament and declaring the gospel throughout the known world, but when they first heard it, they didn't believe it. And so if you try to tell somebody that, that Jesus rose from the dead and that makes all the difference in their life, that's true, but they're not going to believe you necessarily. And when they don't believe you, don't get upset about it, because even the disciples didn't believe. It's a common response. And so we continue on. Later, he appeared, verse 12. After that, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they walked and went into the country. And they went and told it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. And so we have this, and we have it in other Gospels, the account of what happened, these 2 guys who were out on the road, and they come back to the upper room, and they're like, hey, we saw Jesus, he talked with us, he walked with us, and we didn't even know who it was, and then he was revealed as we were sitting down to dinner, and he poofed out of the room, and we ran back here to tell you that Jesus is alive, we saw him. And so now you have Mary, you have these 2 guys in a separate account, and the disciples who were there, Peter, James, John, all of them. What was their response? Again,
didn't believe it.
We don't believe you. The dead people don't come back from the dead. We're not sure what you did see, but there's no way you saw Jesus. And so here again, they're being presented with a second witness, a second testimony, different people, different situation, different scenario, same message, and same response. Sometimes we come along after somebody else has shared the gospel and we share it a second time. We're a different person with a different presentation in a different way, and we get the same result. People don't believe. We can get discouraged, or we can continue sharing the message. And I think it's important that we continue sharing. If we share it, eventually some people are going to catch it, and that eventually does happen here as well. But just understand, when you get discouraged because people don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, understand that is a common response. We continue in verse 14. Later, he appeared to the 11 as they sat at the table, and he rebuked their unbelief and hardness of heart because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. And so Jesus emerges into the room where they are, and they're there gathered, and he says, you guys should have believed. Now, why could he yell at them that way? Because for weeks before his death, he kept telling them, I am going to Jerusalem, I am going to die, but after I die, 3 days later, I'm coming back from the dead. This isn't the end, it's just a pause in the middle. I am going to do what I need to do, and then I'm going to come back from the dead. He told them in no vague terms that he was going to die and that he was going to come back from the dead, and they missed it. They didn't believe he was going to die. They didn't believe he could come back from the dead. But here he is standing in the room with them. It's kind of hard to deny when he's there, saying, you guys should have gotten this right. I told you, I told you, I told you, you should have believed. And then when you say these people who come and they say I've risen from the dead, you should have believed because I told you that's what was going to happen. And so, yeah, he rebukes them a bit, and yeah, they deserve it. You ever been in the place, though, where they were? We talk about sometimes that our faith and our fear are something that hold in tension. That it's a tension we don't often resolve. We tend to manage it more than we resolve it. Because we all have those moments where we're like, is this real? Did Jesus really die? Did Jesus really come back from the dead? Are my sins really forgiven? Is heaven really my home? We have those moments of fear. All of us do. And it is a natural, normal part of the process as believers. Even though Jesus has told us clearly, even though Jesus has demonstrated, as he did with them, time and time and time again, the power and the authority that he has, we still get in the place occasionally where we're sitting there in the darkness of our life, in the turbulence of our life, and we just ask ourselves, is this real? What if I'm wrong? It's a normal reaction. Jesus dealt with these guys. It was a normal reaction. He dealt with them a little bit harshly. He rebuked them because they knew it was real. They had seen God act. And we're in the same boat. When we get in that moment of self-doubt, a little bit of rebuke might go a long way, because if we've been walking with the Lord for a while, we know that he's real. We know that he's alive. He has impacted and interacted in our lives in unmistakable ways that we sometimes get a little selective in our memory and forget a little bit. So a little bit of rebuke goes a long way. Remember what you do know. Remember what you have seen. Remember the experiences that you have had. Remember the words that he did say, that you did hear, and anchor your faith in those things. Manage that fear, that tension, by remembering what you've heard, remembering what you have seen and what you've witnessed. And let that lead you in the direction of faith. Minimize the pull that fear has on you that way. And so here he is, he's rebuking them. And he said to them in verse 15, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, every person. I guess you could preach it to dogs and cats too. I don't think they're going to get it. But every created person. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. Now, if you have a red letter Bible and you're following along, and I hope you are doing both, or at least following along, but if you have that, notice that the color of those words is in red. These are the words of Jesus. Jesus said, if you believe, then you will be saved. If you do not believe, you will be condemned. People like to say, oh, Jesus would never condemn anybody to hell. And that is not true. By his own words, he said, if you do not believe, you will be condemned. That again, pretty plain. We like to ignore it. We don't like the words, and so we disregard them. But the simple fact is, if you do not believe, you will be condemned. If the people around you do not believe, they will be condemned per Jesus. And that's pretty authoritative. Notice he put in baptism right there with belief. In the early church, just like in some churches today, baptism follows salvation very rapidly. In the early church, they were practiced almost simultaneously. You got saved, they looked around, found some water, dunked you right away. And so we have that close association of those two things. But that belief is paramount. If you don't believe, you'll be condemned. That's Jesus' words. And so he's telling the disciples, you need to go out and you need to take this message of my death and burial and resurrection out to the world, because they don't know it and they won't know it unless you tell them, and they can't believe it unless you tell them. But if they don't believe it, they're going to be condemned. And so he really kind of lights the fire under them to go and to share the gospel with everyone, because that's the only way anybody has, that's the only hope anybody has of not being condemned. If you believe, you'll be saved. If you don't, you're condemned. Jesus' own words. And he goes on in verse 17, and these signs will follow those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons, they will speak with new tongues, they will take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover. And so Jesus said, there are all these signs that are going to go with you, that are going to confirm the authority and confirm the authenticity of the message that you have. And this we find in the early church was very rampant. You go into the book of Acts as the early church expanded, and we find instances where all of these things took place. And then he goes on and to say that these were going to go to give them authority, to validate that. Now today we have a more sure word of prophecy, Peter would tell us in his epistles, and that being the sure word of the scriptures, which it's a lot easier to authenticate a message when you can go back to the text and say, see, this is exactly what Jesus said. So I don't recommend you playing with poisonous snakes, and I don't recommend you drinking arsenic, and I don't recommend you doing a lot of things that people do out of foolishness to validate the gospel. The validation of the gospel is right here. It's you declaring it. It's you going back to this supernaturally preserved book and saying, here's what Jesus said in the Gospel of Mark. And then you could turn over to the Gospel of Matthew, written by a different dude in a different time and place, and say, oh, look at this. He said that Jesus said the same thing. And you can go over to the book of John, and you say, look, here's John, written by a different dude in a different time, in a different place. And look, he said the same thing. We have several witnesses to what Jesus said. And so we have, as Peter called it, a more sure word of prophecy. But we have the validation. Your life is a testimony. Your ability to understand the scriptures and share the scriptures is a way to validate the message that you're going to share with people. Jesus rose from the dead. How do we know he rose from the dead? Because we have all of these eyewitness accounts. Don't be fooled by the fact that this is in one binding. Goodness, if that's the problem, take it out of its binding and treat each book individually. In fact, I saw recently that you can do that. They're publishing the Bible in a magazine format, each book of the Bible separately. Fine, it's glossy, it's got pictures, it's great. If that's how you dig it. That's good. But understand that each of these books of the Bible are separate. They're individual. They corroborate each other. They were gathered into one book, but that doesn't make them one book. Anyway, I digress. But we have a more sure word of prophecy. So know it, utilize it. We continue in verse 19. So then, after the Lord had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them and confirming the word through the accompanying signs. Amen. So be it. That's the end. And so Mark, again, this gospel reads very rapidly. Mark comes through the resurrection right into the early church. I mean, he just summed up in one verse what Luke took an entire book to write in the book of Acts. He said, they went out and they did what they were supposed to do. They went out and shared the message of Jesus everywhere. Some people got it, some people didn't, but they did what they were supposed to do. And so the purpose that they did not have on that Sunday morning before they met Jesus, they had. By the time they met with Jesus and had been reprimanded for their unbelief, by Monday morning they had purpose. They had a plan. Their life's work was going to be sharing all the things that Jesus had taught them. That was always his plan. They were just a little late to the party. And the good news is that's God's plan for us as well. We talk about reflecting God to people so that we can direct people to God. That's our purpose as a church. That's our purpose as individuals. That's the goal that God has for us, regardless of what else is going on. Pandemic, no pandemic, financial uncertainty, financial certainty, whatever situation you find yourself in life, God's plan for you, God's purpose for you, is to take what you know from this more sure word of prophecy, to share with people that Jesus died for their sins, that he was buried, and that he rose again in victory over sin and death and hell, giving them victory and giving them purpose of sharing that message with the people around them. There's hope, there's purpose, there's what we need on a Sunday when we're suddenly on Facebook Live because we can't gather together. Our purpose is undiminished, and so is our potential. Would you pray with me? Father, we love you. We're thankful for your word. We're thankful for the disciples and all that they accomplished. The fact that here we are, thousands of years later, still talking about this seminal moment in history. Because they shared, they did their job. We believed it. Would you help us to do our job, we pray. Thank you in Jesus' good name. Amen. God bless you. I love you. Have a fantastic week. I'll see you right back here Thursday morning at 9 a.m. for our Thanksgiving service. It'll be different, but we'll be here.